Okay, on Thursday, I promised to look more closely at, the prepared statements of the meeting of the Committee on Foreign Affairs concerning Syria and Iran. A little background on the speakers first. There were three people who spoke before this committee. Mr. John Bolton, former U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations and former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Ollie Heinemann, International Atomic Energy Agency Deputy Director General and Head of the Department of Safeguards. And Mr. Robert Satloff, Executive Director for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Each speaker had a prepared statement for the committee. I've looked into the actual transcripts of the meeting to see what kinds of questions the committee might have asked, but I couldn't find any. If any of you might have links to the transcript of this meeting, please let me know. The guy I want to focus on first is John Bolton. Of the three speakers, he's most vocal in his assertions that either the United States or Israel needs to launch some sort of preemptive strike against Iran's nuclear program. This document is some 18 pages in length, and I'm not going to read all of it. I will provide links so you guys can download your own copies if you want. Okay. Mr. Bolton begins his statement by focusing on Iran, offering up a scathing critique of the current administration's apparent disregard for Iran's continued pursuit of nuclear power and presumably weapons technology. He asserts that the existing tactic to punish Iran with economic sanctions may well work to destabilize the government and force regime change over the long term. But Mr. Bolton is also quick to point out that the most heavily sanctioned nation upon the planet, North Korea, has still managed to successfully detonate 2 nuclear devices and is aggressively pursuing its ballistic missile program. If Mr. Bolton would have his way, we'd attack Iran or get Israel to do it for us. And I quote, "Since diplomacy has failed, since sanctions have failed, and since disruptive efforts have failed, the only realistic alternative, and it's decidedly an unhappy one, is to use force preemptively against Iran's nuclear weapons program." His statement reads like a hit piece with all manner of rhetoric designed to stoke fears that Iran will very soon have a nuclear bomb and use it, most likely on Israel, and it's our duty to stop them. Mr. Bolton begins his assessment of Syria's nuclear capabilities by referring to testimony he gave as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security back in 2003. He apparently presented testimony for both open and closed sessions and was later criticized by then-Senator Joseph Biden, who felt he was overstating Syria's financial and technological capacity to engage in a nuclear program. He goes on to link Iran to Lebanon and by proxy Hezbollah, and as well as North Korea, speculating that the three nations were jointly involved in the construction of the now destroyed Syrian nuclear reactor at Al-Kibar, which was allegedly built by North Korean workers. Much of this portion of his statement is pure speculation. Mr. Bolton continually tries to link North Korea and Iran to Syria as potential suppliers of technology and other resources, asserting that both nations have an interest in doing so to escape international scrutiny over their own illicit nuclear programs. He doesn't seem to think that there will be a conflict in Syria, however, simply because it could escalate into a larger conflict with Iran. But given his statements above where he advocates military action against Iran's nuclear facilities, I don't think the man would have any problem with the United States or Israel doing exactly that. Okay, on to Ollie J. Heinen's testimony. And this one's pretty fast. Again, I'll provide links to the full statement. Mr. Heinen's testimony before the committee serves to validate Mr. Bolton's statement regarding both Syria and Iran. While the man doesn't openly call for military action, he provides statistical data that bolsters Mr. Bolton's panicky views. His sentiments regarding Syria are purely speculative in nature, but the questions he asks are clearly designed to get people thinking more and more about the nation's connection between Iran and North Korea. I'll give you a little quote here. Questions also remain Syria's nuclear program. Was the destroyed reactor built at the Deir al-Zur site the only clandestine nuclear facility in the country? Are the uranium particles found in Damascus and at the Deir al-Zur a sign of more substantial activities yet to be uncovered? Does Syria possess ready fuel for the reactor, either in stock or in production? What does the nature and extent of nuclear ties between Syria and the People's Republic of North Korea, and between Syria and Pakistan? Were other players involved? The Deir al-Zur reactor does not exist any longer, but the IAEA has to ensure that all nuclear material in Syria is declared and is in peaceful activities, and therefore requires full cooperation and access from Syria. Okay, on to Mr. Robert Satloff's testimony. Of the three speakers, Mr. Satloff is the most worrisome in my opinion, not because he's necessarily fear-mongering, but because he's in favor of further destabilizing the nation, especially its political ties to other countries. America, to quote him, America will benefit from the demise of the Assad regime. No successor regime will be as committed as the Assad regime has shown itself to be to implementing a broad range of destabilizing and dangerous policies, from pursuing a clandestine and illegal nuclear weapons program to arming and supporting radical Islamic militias in Lebanon and in the Palestinian arena, to facilitating attacks on U.S. troops via foreign fighters in Iraq. And while the United States should work with its friends and allies to do everything possible to ensure the emergence of a successor regime that is pluralistic, representative of democratic, and mindful of minority rights, the emergence of a new regime that falls short of that objective, a distinct possibility, I regret to note, will still constitute a substantial blow to our strategic adversaries in the region and will therefore serve U.S. interests. Indeed, the argument that Assad represents the devil we know has lost purchase, not only among many American strategists, but among European, Arab, Israeli, and Turkish leaders and strategists as well. Okay, what Mr. Satloff has apparently forgotten is that the deposition of a reviled leader doesn't always work out the way we hope. Our actions in Iraq resulted in the ousting of Saddam Hussein, but also plunged the nation into war that resulted in approximately 4,500 American deaths and the deaths of over 100,000 Iraqis. The deposition of President Mubarak of Egypt hasn't helped that nation either. In fact, it set the stage for Islamic hardliners such as the Muslim Brotherhood to come and take control of Egypt, opening the door for closer ties with Iran. Okay, so what are Mr. Satloff's recommendations for ways we might affect the situation, as he puts it? Well, let's check it out. The first thing we can do is raise the level of our bilateral consultations with key regional players. Okay, you got to read between the lines here. He points out Turkey, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel, and we can get their assessment of the Syrian situation and their individual joint and collective contributions to assist the Syrian people. What he's saying here is, even though this sounds all fluffy and flowery, Mr. Satloff is really saying we use intelligence assets in organizations like Mossad to work further destabilize the situation by organizing peaceful protests, which usually mean running guns or possibly even financing full-scale revolution. 2, we can create an international contact group on Syria that underscores the intense concern and interest among important regional players for the fate of the Syrian people. The purpose is both political and operational, to organize refugee support, supply of humanitarian goods to besieged areas, etc. This is just another way of saying we should get NATO involved, like it has been in the campaign in Libya. 3, we can consider the establishment of humanitarian relief zones. Humanitarian is just a watchword, people. In specified areas along Syria's borders with its neighbors, in addition to providing a supply of goods and relief to refugees and perhaps to embattled communities inside the country. Such zones would underscore the idea that the international community recognizes that change in Syria began on the periphery and is inexorably moving towards the center of the country, as evidenced by the rising tide of protest in virtually every major urban area. Okay, here he's pretty clearly stating that we need to form staging areas under the auspices of humanitarian relief zones, and possibly even go so far as to embed intelligence organizations like the CIA and Mossad and special forces groups in country to further destabilize the nation. He even states key cities that we should look at as focus of potential operations, like Homs, Hama, and even Damascus. Okay, I could go on here, but I won't. He cites more ways in which we could bring change, but I really don't have time to cover it all. Okay, in conclusion, I think these speakers are clearly making a case for future military involvement in, at the very least, Syria, and at some later point, Iran. This meeting reminds me of all the hearings we saw dealing with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2002 and 2003 as the Bush administration came forward to make its case for war. They're getting all of this on record, folks, so when we do eventually put boots on the ground, or when that false flag attack does happen, they can point to the hearings like this and say, hey, we told you this stuff was going to happen. As a side note, it seems that today Congress, or yesterday now, Congress voted to reject a measure expressing support for the war in Libya, but they also rejected a measure to cut funding as well, so really not much has changed. It's like saying, okay, I'm pissed you took the money I gave you and leased a car with it instead of paying rent on the house, but I'm not going to stop giving you money to pay for the car. You know, it's all just smoke and mirrors, folks. Thanks for watching.